Being born in D.C. Is an odd thing because you don't automatically think of local politics. You're more focused on national politics or international politics, and that's what I always really cared about until maybe about 2.5 years ago. National politics. There's very little to stretch your mind beyond what's here now. If you haven't lived somewhere else and you don't know what your rights are, unless something really just slaps you in the face or you go somewhere else and come back, you really don't think about it. My entrance in the movement came out of anger. I was just angry. I just could not accept the fact that we were going to be disrespected like this.
We need democracy! How you doing? How you doing today, sir? How you doing? We need democracy here in D.C. Stand up for democracy. How you doing? We need democracy. All right. We need it.
Don't give up. Don't give up. Thank you for being out here so that these critters know that I'm talking for somebody besides myself. Hey. You knew they disrespected your elected officials, your mayor and your city council. But I hope that you know who they really disrespect are the people of the District of Columbia, because that is who, in fact, brought back here. It was not your council, it was not your mayor, it was the people themselves. And they gave the back of their hand to the people of the District of Columbia.
Everywhere, letting everyone know that the fight is not over, that we are standing in modern-day Mississippi. No democracy here in D.C. The fight is on. Let's keep fighting till victory is won.
I don't even remember having any sense of the political situation in Washington. That's just how much of a colony this was. There was no politics to be conscious of. There was no mayor, no home rule. You couldn't vote for president. I never remember coming to the Capitol once as a child. That shows you how far away from us the Capitol must have been. People got so used to living without the vote. The notion of not having home rule began to penetrate the consciousness of black and white people in this town when the civil rights movement penetrated the consciousness.
Around this time, February 1st, 1960, the student movement erupted in North Carolina, which was very electrifying all over the country. Now, you have to understand that this is a period of incubation for me on a personal level.
My name is James Foreman. I'm the Executive Secretary of Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee.
All of this was in preparation to work full-time at the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee to try to help formulate plans and programs that could eliminate segregation in the South and help people to get the right to vote. Because it was not just black people in these southern states who were denied the right to vote. A lot of white people were also denied the right to vote. The fight for representative government in the District of Columbia was not something that we felt, that should be put on the back burner. Removing some of the controls of the federal government on the District of Columbia would be more difficult than it would be to get the right to vote in these southern states.
Literally, every committee was controlled by a white Southerner. Not only white Southerners, but racist white Southerners. And since Congress was the awesome, omnipresent power, people who lived here didn't have anything to compare it with.
We would not be free in Washington to vote, to elect our own mayor and city council, until black people were free in the South to vote. their votes in the South would affect the behavior of the Southern Democrats, who had held a stranglehold on the District of Columbia. The only way to break that system was to prevent members like that from returning, members who simply had to go back south and say, keep the blacks down and get reelected because blacks couldn't vote.
I would not think that this would be any time to change anybody who had the knowledge of parliamentary procedure and the knowledge of what has been going on in previous years, as we could have this government overthrown.
The chairman of the district committee from South Carolina, John L. McMillan, had a number of reasons for wanting to be chairman of the district committee. The chairman of the district committee had the say-so on what district government did, so that if some friends back home needed jobs, since he was in effect the mayor of the District of Columbia, he could just send them over to the three commissioners and say, look, find my boy a job.
A cast of hundreds assembled in Dillon, South Carolina for Johnny Mac Day. Big-name politicians, bands, pretty girls, hot barbecue, and red-hot political speeches, all in honor of Congressman John L. McMillan, who incidentally is up for re-election.
You have to go back. It was another world before then. Kennedy was certainly an enormously inspirational president. The reality is, in terms of substance, virtually nothing happened during those 3 years of the Kennedy administration. In July of '65, the president asked me to come over, and he created the job of domestic advisor to prepare the legislative program, to get it passed, to handle any domestic crises, and to coordinate economic policy. And I think he realized that the country needed a revolution. And, it was a revolution of enormous proportions. We have to remember something. Lyndon Johnson was a Texan, but he lived in Washington for 35 years. He saw D.C. as a symbol for the world as well as the country. Two things, I think, drove that and increased his interest in doing something about the district. One was the Voting Rights Act.
President Johnson signed the 1965 Voter Registration Act and pledged to millions of Americans a new chance to find a political...
As far as the writ of federal law will run, we must abolish not some, but all racial discrimination.
I cannot overestimate the extent to which he was committed to the concept of people voting.
For this is not merely an economic issue, or a social, political, or international issue. It is a moral issue.
And secondly, we were always, in those years, in a race against time. I mean, as we were providing more and more light at the end of the tunnel, what was once accepted as inevitable, particularly by African Americans, became intolerable because they wanted more and more faster. And he understood that. He was deeply concerned about having a problem in the nation's capital.
The people must be given the right to elect their own representatives in the Congress of the United States. The people must be given the most basic right of all, home rule.
He really didn't think Congress should be in the business of running the district.
Of that, I am sure.
The president proposed a bill in 1965. He really revved it up.
The president was very much in favor of home rule. He told me to draft a bill and let's see where we can go with it. And the bill got through the Senate without any trouble. The problem was in the House District Committee, headed by John McMillan of South Carolina, who was as opposed to home rule as anybody I ever knew.
Knows the procedure of the committee system to appear with it. Well, I hope to fill some of that.
And he was not going to permit it to come out of the committee. president, he said, you know, you're really responsible for a lot of my loss of power because until the Home Rule Bill, I'd never lost on the Hill. By God, I lost that one, and it's your fault, Charlie. I've been going downhill ever since. I don't think he held it against me, but I think it was true. That was the first real fight that he'd put on that he hadn't come out on.
And then I came up with the recommendation as part of the legislative program to get something approaching home rule in the district. And he loved it. He loved it. The president would appoint somebody we always viewed as the mayor, but because of the whole political situation, would be the commissioner and the deputy commissioner. If the reorganization plan sat there for 60 or 90 days, it became law if a majority of people did not vote against it. And remarkably, without a lot of discussion or debate, it became law. But as soon as we got it passed, President Johnson started calling him the mayor and the deputy mayor. And he wanted to appoint the first black mayor of an American city. And he was determined to do that.
And Johnson decided that the first black mayor of Washington should be me. And when this was conveyed to me, I thought it was the dumbest thing I'd heard. I'm not really from and of Washington. And these people are not stupid. You can't give them any old black person and say, well, here's a black person, so you should be happy now. These people are proud of being Washingtonians. They've been here for a long time. They care about their city. They have their traditions and their memories and their webs of friendships and relationships. And I don't have any of that. And he scheduled a press conference. And I said, tell him, if he announces me, I am going to say, no, I won't do it. And so he got up there and he stood in front of the people. And they expected some kind of announcement. And he looked kind of uncomfortable. He looked around and he said, well, any questions?
So we then decided on Walter Washington. He was then the housing commissioner in New York City.
And I thought Walter was a wonderful mayor for the time. I thought he was just what the city needed, and I am glad to have had a part, maybe only a small part, but a part anyway, in the selection of Walter. I think probably that's the best thing I ever did for the city.
We would then have a city council that the president would appoint, but eventually they would become elected officials. And Johnson wanted Hechinger. Hechinger turned up to be the right guy. And Hechinger did not want to do it.
I was very reluctant. I was president of my company at the time, which was maybe one of the main reasons for not accepting it. I ended up in the White House. Joe Califano, who was President Johnson's closest assistant, tried to convince me.
Constantly, the phone would ring, and Johnson had this hotline to his top assistants, which did not ring intermittently. It was just one solid ring until you answered. The president calls me on this hotline and says, if he tells you no, you tell him he can't say no to you. He's got to say it to his president. So we go to the living quarters, and the president was getting dressed. I remember this so vividly. Bring Hechinger in, introduce me, never met him. They walk over to a window in the living room in the living quarters where you can look out over the mall. And Hechinger says, what a magnificent view. And Johnson says, yes, it's a beautiful city, and I want to keep it that way. But I can't keep it that way unless I get the right people in office. I have to go to a meeting about Vietnam. I've got so many problems in Vietnam. I can't pay as much attention to the city as I'd like to. That's why I need you. And he says, now, will you help your president?
He says, you're absolutely right, turning something like this down. He said, like this folder under my arm is whether to bomb Haiphong Harbor. He's got to make a life or death decision for thousands of men. And I was refusing to do this duty of chairman of the city council. And I said, oops, you got me, Mr. President. And it just clicked in my mind. I said, I give up.
And then says to me, take him over, walk him right into the press room and announce him before he can do anything else. And we open the door, and it's the White House press corps.
They had already put together a press release. A photographer was there, and so they didn't fool around waiting for my willingness to do it.
And that's how he got named. Then he came back to my office and called his wife, who had just heard it on WTOP, the local news radio station in Washington.
There's much written about Lyndon Johnson and his forceful ways of getting done what he wanted done. The whole thing looked like a setup to me, that they knew that if Johnson wanted something, he was going to get it.
And that's how the city council was put together. He didn't know what happened to him, but he loved the job. And Walter did too. They all did.
He was an enormously tall man, which I hadn't realized. And I'll never forget the dialogue. He said, good morning, Mr. Nevius. He said, are you a Republican? And I said, yes, sir, I certainly am, Mr. President. In fact, I'm a vice chairman of the Republican Committee of the District of Columbia. Good, he says. And he says, how old are you? And I said, I'm 49 years old, Mr. President. Great, he said, you're young. And with that, I kid you not, within 10 minutes later, the whole bunch of us were ushered into the East Room, and there the room was filled with people sitting in these gold chairs, and there was a row of 9 gold chairs right in the front row. They were empty, and we were filed in and sat down, and the president got up to his podium and announced his city council.
And this is the day, and this is the year, that the district emerges into the world of the 20th century government. With the recent reorganization plan, the nation's capital was liberated from the outworn practices of the past years. That reorganization
President Johnson said to me when he appointed me, I want you to do this job for us. It's a difficult job. You then were dealing with powers, the Board of Commissioners that had actually been the executive form of governing for some 100 years.
Men with the strength and the character.
They built a whole body of laws, practices that had to be virtually overnight transformed into a form of mayor and a council. This meant redistribution of the functions of government in some 60 or 65 different units, from the fire police department to the health department to the hospitals to the personnel office. It's hard for people to recall that probably this is the only time in history that this ever occurred, where you've had to take a going government, transform it into a new form of government practically overnight, so that people, when they woke up on the next morning, would know where they were.
The first time I heard of Julius, there was a news broadcast, and it said, we're all celebrating today because we now have an appointed city council.
Creating a new city government for the nation's capital, a government responsive to its people's needs, had long been a dream of President Johnson.
We're going to have an office and we're going to be a real city council. And what do you think about that, Mr. Hobson?
Well, I think Mr. Washington's a good man from Mr. Johnson's point of view, if you would ask me to describe.
Mr. Hobson answered, instead of 3 people not representing me, I now have 11.
Like a point he and Mr. Johnson makes, I'd say colorless, tasteless, and odorless would be a good description of Mr. Washington.
And I thought, that guy's got to be brilliant, because that's all he said. He would make it so ridiculous like that. After that, I never liked the city council, because I just figured there were 11 people not representing me.
I appreciate very much.
Julius would wake up in the morning and read the newspaper, and that was his agenda for the day. His stress was if he wasn't doing something, rather than if he was.
And they're going to abide by it as long as my name is Julius Hobson.
He never hid me. He would insist that I come with him to black churches and to everywhere else. When it was announced in the paper that we were getting married, his secretary, who was black, just cried and cried because she said, but he's a black man and she's taking him away from us. And Julius said, there isn't any black woman in her right mind who'd marry me.
We call our program Ladies of the Press. Our guest on this program is the famous Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, chairman of...
I was impressed with Adam, his outspokenness, his militancy, a man with enormous charisma. He took controversial positions on things.
What's happening now is not a leader's revolution. The black revolution is a people's revolution. Therefore, no one, beginning with Dr. Martin Luther King at the top and coming on down to me at the bottom, has the power to keep essentially our teenagers from just blindly striking out in the dark against their hopelessness.
That sound you just heard was the sound of a tear gas fired by a police officer in an attempt to thwart this unruly demonstration. We repeat, several Negro youths started running down Main Street, smashing windows as they...
We want black power! We want black power! We want black power!
America doesn't realize that how frightening the Black Power movement was. People were horrified.
We have to move to a position where
You have no idea, because to a lot of white people, Black Power meant some big black juggernaut coming over the hills to rape their little white daughters.
It's to build a power base so strong in this country that will bring them to their knees every time they mess with us.
It polarized the country immediately. In fact, a lot of black leaders condemned the Black Power movement.
As black men in America.
Black Power was a quest for self-recognition, and that's all Black Power was. Where Ralph Ellison wrote about the invisible man, this was making the invisible man visible. You do a taxonomy of power at that time, it was all white. There were no blacks involved. So to challenge that infrastructure was what a lot of white people felt frightened about, and that's why they resisted it. They didn't see themselves as pursuing power because they already had the power. The white community had empowered itself. So they had the power. They had all the congressmen, all the senators, all the governors. They had everything. Remember, I was editor of the Washington Afro-American. And I took strong positions on everything.
White America has been able to split us and make us everything but black. We have got to come to the recognition that we are oppressed as a group, not as individuals. And we must get the strength to say that individualism is a luxury that we can no longer afford.
Remember Stokely Carmichael? He'd just gotten back from, it was either Vietnam or Korea. It was a very controversial trip he had made. But when he came back to America, he was a major figure. Stokely Carmichael became a force in district politics.
We had a little group called the Nonviolent Action Group, which was working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was primarily based in the South. But since we were here in Washington, D.C., I thought that we couldn't turn a blind spot on what was going on in Washington, and since Mr. Julius Hobson seemed to be the man closest to our line of thinking, that is, not only was he a theoretician, but also a man of practice, we decided to contact him. And when we contacted him, he outlined his program on agitation and trying to bring about raising the level of consciousness of black people in the North. We joined with him, and he did do many, many things.
I would say most certainly that Julius Hobson was at least 100 years ahead of his time. And that is why people really did not understand, but one day maybe they will.
There's not just one Johnson. There's the domestic Johnson who was the good Johnson.
On April 22nd, President Johnson signed a bill which gave the citizens of the District of Columbia the right to elect their own school board. Overall, it had been a momentous year for the district.
We have installed a mayor and a city council in the city hall. The new government is responding to the needs and the hopes of the people in day-to-day operations and in crisis as well. With this legislation, we will restore another basic right of popular government, the right of people to help shape the education of their children.
America wins the wars that she undertakes, make no mistake about it. And we have declared war on ignorance and illiteracy. We have declared war on poverty.
And then there was the foreign policy Johnson, who was the failure, and who knew he was failing. Johnson did not like to fail, but all his ploys failed.
And we have declared war on tyranny and aggression.
Bombs in Vietnam exploded home. They destroyed the dream and possibility for a decent America. It is estimated that we spend
But when Martin opposed him on the war and blacks were rioting in the cities and making it look like he couldn't govern the country, all these crazy people running around the streets burning things up, he began to understand, I think, that there was too much. Can't fix 2 centuries in one short presidential term. Although he tried.
From 59 to 68. I was across the street from Clifton Terrace. That's a well-known apartment house. It was a 1-floor unit and definitely integrated from the time I was there. I knew everybody. In fact, I closed on Jewish holidays and people respected me. And I hired an Afro-American pharmacist that I knew. And we had about 3 soda fountain girls. People came every day and ate at the fountain. Sold a cup of coffee for $0.10 and made a living, or a milkshake for $0.25. We had hamburgers for 15 cents. So I had a lot of memories in the drugstore. I was more at home there, and even though it was a lot of hours, it was an interesting experience. I had to put in an average of 70, 80 hours a week, otherwise I wouldn't have made it. Then came the riot.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee, shot in the face as he stood alone in the balcony of his hotel room. He died in a hospital an hour later.
I asked every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
Look, people could see on their television sets that there was all this motion in the South. And nothing is happening at 5th and T. Nothing. But they see it on the TV that something's supposed to be happening. And the police harassed them. And I know the police harassed them. They harassed me. And I was a middle-class guy in the New Southwest. They sure as heck were harassing. And in the end, all these riots in April 1968 were the same thing. Somebody shot a black guy and black people went nuts. So to ask whether Washington could have been saved, yeah, somebody could have stopped the people who killed Martin King. But, you know, you kill Martin and all bets are off.
The riot began at 14th and U at the People's Drug, and they moved upward. they decided about 10 o'clock Thursday night, one person broke the glass, and the next thing you know, they're started going up the street. I was only about 5 blocks up. I had an employee, Raymond Flowers, who lived next door, and he called me, he said, Doc, call me Doc, they're looting the store, and I called the police. I said, Larry Rosen, Smith Pharmacy, they're looting my store. And the police said, I'm sorry, sir, there's nothing we can do. They're looting up and down 14th Street.
It was a time of rage, fear. It was emotions were just all over the place. It was something that had to come out. It was something that had to boil over because the hurts and all the suffering that we have gone through, it was just something that the rage came out on material things rather than people.
Someone called, said, you better leave because some of the stores are being burnt. I went home, I watched it on TV. Friday was the night they burned the store.
You kept saying, well, now, you destroyed our own area. Why didn't you go to the White House? But they just didn't do that. You destroyed us, and we don't have a store to go to. We want to go to Dime, so we had to go to Maryland. Then when you saw the troops coming in and surrounding your house, and when you went to church, the troops were all over the place. I mean, you were just frightened to death. You felt like you were in an armed camp, and you didn't know what was going to happen, whether they were going to shoot you on sight or not. It brought up so many fears of people in this city.
When they came into the town, the city was already in flames. It was too late. Had they come in Thursday night, maybe things would have been better. All mostly small merchants, and all sustained heavy burning and damage. Why is it it's always that the merchant gets hit? What's he got to do with it? It seems to be an outlet.
The whole city, was in shock from the murder of Martin Luther King. But there was no surprise that there was a reaction like that. And nobody really felt that it was unjustified. I guess that's where you go into the division between the white and the black Washington again. Washington was and is a segregated city, a very segregated city. And when you have two cultures, particularly one culture that's not being respected, you have to expect things like that are going to happen.
Being Jewish, some people said it was anti-Semitism, and I say it was not. The problem was that the governing officials couldn't control it. They did make arrests. It was hard to control, it's true. And it was easy to go in a store and pick up a television. Say, what the heck? Everybody's grabbing. Why won't I grab something? People are people, and when it's easy, and that's what happened. So I don't think if they cared what religion you were or what color you were. I feel that if you got that hatred in you, they can tell. I never had it.
You think, sir, that large-scale violence is possible across this country and perhaps even probable?
Well, I don't want to predict. I just think that we've all got to plan, prepare, not overreact, remain as calm and cool as we can, and see if we can't make reason out of this, because nonviolence was what Dr. King stood for.
Walter Washington played an interesting role in this whole thing because Walter Washington was clearly in the middle, and he saw himself in the middle. That was his function.
And to try to get our cities in order.
He was cautious, but he was also very effective in terms of moving opinion.
Way to bring order to our cities and to our nation, and I think we can do it. I'm optimistic. Thank you. I've got to go.
All right. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you very much. All right.
There is a certain evidence that the riots did scare a lot of people in power. First of all, there was a response of conscience. I think a lot of people in this country, white and black, were genuinely shocked by what happened. Where something bad happens and people come together and they say, well, God, we've really got to do something. Second of all, there was a response of fear. After all, we're talking about a Congress that had been largely dominated by Southern segregationists. My assumption has always been that we got home rule, in no small part because of the riots.
I went back after the store was burned down. It was, let's put it this way, it was like a nightmare because we didn't know what to do. The biggest asset of any business is goodwill. Goodwill is that intangible value, the value of the store, your livelihood, what you're getting out of it. And there's no insurance for that. The Jewish merchant, as you know, talking about history, is no more after the riot. People say forget about it, but part of my life, I'm trying to forget about it.
My own view was that by then Johnson was really furious at all of us black people. And the blacks seemed insatiable, always not enough, not enough, not enough. It must have just broken his heart to have to step down from the presidency.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
When Johnson signed the 64 Civil Rights Act, he said, we're turning the South over to the Republican Party for my lifetime and yours. He knew the price the Democrats would pay.
We've been putting out billions of dollars for programs, for federal jobs and federal housing and federal welfare. And I'll tell you what we've reaped. We've reaped the harvest of riot and frustration and failure. And now they want to put billions more into the same programs, and I say no. My friends, I say when you're on a wrong road, you get off of it and you take a new road.
I think there was just a sense of turmoil and disturbance in the country and the hope that Nixon would be able to be tougher or straighten it out. All of that.
By the time I arrived, it was a time of great ferment in the country, as you know. I came to Washington in February of 1969. I thought I'll stay for a year and see what it's like, and I've been here ever since. I've always loved politics because if you believe in the principle of self-determination, I can't think of anything better to study. So I understood pretty well what was going on in this town.
Good evening. If you have just joined us, we are obliged to tell you the story we've been running since shortly after 2 this afternoon.
There were anti-war demonstrations, huge anti-war demonstrations in the city. That's where my focus was mainly.
We'll get to the entire story beginning right now with Eyewitness News correspondent Max Robinson.
The president turned away from this moratorium. In any case, what happened today is that an awful lot of Americans took the Constitution at face value and asserted their right peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
It was an exciting time, actually, to be here, to watch the people agitating for change and finally getting their hands, they thought, on some power.
This is 1960, 1970.
The civil rights contingent of people who started settling into Washington in the 60s came to town with an activism that they had I mean, they had risked their lives in varying degrees in the South and were hit with the same kind of realization that everyone seems to be hit with. Well, this is a pretty docile town. It's ripe for takeover.
So a lot of what you might be thinking, a lot of questions you might have and not quite answered, just rest assured that we're working from experience.
And when Johnson said, let's have an elected school board, well, people like Barry ran, and they started seizing the levers of power.
Go and sort of trust that we're going to move and keep the thing going.
You know, people don't give up power very easily. You usually have to take it. This is common to America because it's called politics. So when Marion Barry comes, you have both liberal whites who want to champion and feel good about things, and you have black people who say, yeah, let's be part of the process.
Understand that our position earlier, 2 weeks ago, was that we were...
And he was charismatic. Barry had an audience and a willing media. Reporters found Barry intriguing because he would speak up. The suburbs were not really an issue yet. The reporters weren't scattered to the four winds.
Into the way the police station is operated. If it had not...
So all those things played a role in his ability to shake things up and dislodge the power that was in place.
Thank you very much.
I came to Washington in January of 1965 and ran the SNCC office here. I knew it was the nation's capital, and I knew it was a majority black town, but I hadn't really thought too much about it until I started getting out into the city. I saw sort of Washington like a sleepy southern town. There was no advocacy for democracy. I mean, you know, Walter was all right, but he wasn't a strong advocate. So this town was just a dead town politically. I decided, we got to start a movement. So it came to me that we ought to name it the Free D.C. Movement, because the official position of the Washington Metropolitan Board of Trade was to oppose self-government. I mean, here you have business people making money off of Washingtonians, and people spending thousands of dollars with them downtown at these department stores and using the banking, etc., and they're going to officially oppose our right to be free? I said, that doesn't make sense.
It really would have been butting your head against the wall to go to Macmillan and say, give me a home rule. So what you do is you go and see what is holding the Macmillans in there. Blacks were beginning to register in the Voting Rights Act, and then they had this congressman who was their enslaver as much as ours. So they had more interest in getting rid of him than we did. What happened was a confluence of self-interest.
And in 1969, our efforts were in South Carolina. I noticed that the number of blacks who were registered in the 6th Congressional District, where John Macmillan had been sent to Washington for 30 years, it had risen from 3% to 29%. Not enough to elect a black from that district, but enough to determine which white could win. Took numbers of citizens from the District of Columbia in buses down to the 6th Congressional District to urge more of our people to register and to urge them to vote for an opponent of John L. Macmillan.
Between now and November 3rd, I expect to spend every day and night in visiting every town in my district.
Fauntleroy and all the people following Fauntleroy for our rights, and I was definitely included in that. We went down into southern states lobbying against him, his own home state, and lobbying for blacks to understand what this man was doing, not only to blacks in Washington, but if you do it to blacks in Washington, you're doing it to blacks in Mississippi and Tennessee and California and elsewhere. They understood that.
I think that the people have become conscious of the fact that they are not alone in the struggle and that they no longer have to continue with an individual who for the past 32 years have not voted for those things which would spell progress.
And in fact, it was that because we finally got him the democratic way.
Well, this is a new experience for me. I never dreamed of having people from Washington, New York, and every other place, some as far as Oregon and Washington here, last couple of days, telling the people how to vote and going over all the voting activities of the people of this district. So it is really a new experience.
What is your feeling about that? How do you feel about people coming in here?
Personally, I don't want anyone coming in this district trying to tell people I represent how to vote. I think they're well capable of deciding themselves who they want to represent them in Washington, and I'm willing to abide by any decision they may make.
I'll never forget the day or the hour. It was on October the 12th, 1972, because the news was that Johnny Mack ain't going back.
There was an effort to discharge the Home Rule Bill from the House District Committee, which had always been an impossible task. The result of Lyndon Johnson's mammoth effort, they thought they were going to get the whole shebang. And when that effort failed, that was sort of the end of it. The White House clearly wasn't capable of doing this. A group of young people who were active in the city organized a coalition. And when McMillan was defeated, we mounted a campaign that had never been tried before. There are a couple of ways you lobby Congress. One is insider lobbying, and that was the way that folks in Washington had predominantly tried to get home rule. I really felt we had to go to the states. We had a flood of volunteers to inundate their congressmen with support of home rule. And I found a willingness to do that among the people I contacted. And as long as we could assure them that the bill protected the federal interest, which was the main concern, they thought it was a reasonable proposal. Initially, we targeted 20 members of Congress. But Congress has always been very paternalistic toward the District of Columbia, and they felt we weren't ready for home rule, basically. We selected Charles Dix as one of the 20 members to target. He was the new chair of the committee. He certainly supported home rule, but he was enjoying the perks of the committee. He got a staff, he had some power to wield, and he wasn't actively promoting home rule then and there.
It was a time of great turmoil. And it was just one of those periods when everything was in foment. I mean, from where I was sitting, although people were paying attention to home rule and things of that nature, the larger focus was on whether the Republic was going to survive, given the shenanigans Nixon was up to.
At first it was called the Watergate Caper. 5 men, apparently caught in the act of burglarizing and bugging Democratic headquarters in Washington.
I neither took part in nor knew about any of the subsequent cover-up activities. That was, and that is, the simple truth.
You know, at first nobody pays much attention to it, and then it begins to percolate. And then every day these 2 young reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, are putting this stuff in the paper. It's incredible.
Organizing at the congressional district level was made much more effective by the fact that Nixon was president and that Watergate had occurred and people were more sympathetic to us. For someone to call from Washington who was a volunteer, who cared enough to spend hours phoning people, and to say that our mayor and city council were appointed by President Richard Nixon, I think had a real impact. They were really invested in this. And this happened all over the country. And I think Watergate was maybe more of a factor then than the Civil Rights Act was.
You're wondering whether our constitutional form of government is going to survive. And all of a sudden, Spiro Agnew quits because he's been taking money while he's been a heartbeat away from the president.
The country's 39th vice president has resigned on this day, October 10, 1973.
The White House, shortly after the news of Agnew's resignation and court appearance were made public,
announced that President Nixon will begin immediately to select a successor to the vice president. It is necessary to understand two basic facts. First, it is unconnected to the parallel Watergate investigation of the Nixon administration, and second, its origins were found years before Mr. Agnew became vice president.
The Republican leader of the House had been summoned to a private session with President Nixon in mid-morning, starting the rumors flying that Ford had been picked to be the new vice president.
Today was another day which will get into the history books. The president has made his decision on his choice.
That is a true story. Gerald Ford was on the floor during the home rule debate when he was called off the floor to become vice president.
At 9 o'clock this evening, Eastern Daylight Time, Mr. Nixon will go on television from the East Room in the White House before an audience.
We subsequently got calls from people. I love these stories.
To announce his decision.
You know, people called us from Washington State, little towns in Washington State, and said, "What happened? We couldn't believe it. It's not been reported in our local paper here, but we know that it was up for a vote because it was on the news."
It may have been that they got the home rule bill through because of the distraction of Watergate and Spiro T. Agnew and all those things.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Although they never got their hands on the purse strings, which is, the problem.
There was a great feeling of exuberance. I took office as the first elected mayor in 104 years in this jurisdiction. Though home rule appeared to be limited, it was something that we finally were able to say was ours. We know we didn't get it all.
Congress controls the purse strings, which means they control everything, really. I don't think there's any easy answer to it. It may be that members of Congress said to themselves, we can't let go of this. We can't put this institution, this federal institution, in the hands of local politicians because they all came out of local politics and they knew what the potential for disaster was. That's one side of the argument. I'm sure there are plenty of people who will tell you that race was a factor. But basically, nobody ever gives up power willingly. Maybe that's the answer. Nobody gives up power willingly. You have to take it.
It's one thing to talk about power, but then you've got the question of what's the legitimate use of power. There were people at the time, Julius Hobson and others, who knew it was going to fail.
Since he wasn't a revolutionary with guns, he had to be a revolutionary in terms of using one step to take the next step to take the next step.
An idea that came out of the clear blue sky. This is a real possibility.
The fact that we have no representation in Congress was the next step, of course. He felt that until you control your money and your justice system, you could not impact in any democratic way the lives of the people living in the community. That's why he began being the dominant presence in the statehood party.
We profess to favor freedom in here, and we will not depreciate agitation. So statehood party, let's go and let's keep it together.
This was part of the revenge of the Southern congressmen who knew that the votes were there to support home rule, but who wanted to make sure it would fail. Well, it failed within 20 years.
You're watching NBC4, working for you. Live from the area's leading news station, this is News 4 at 6.
District residents looking to gain more political rights and more independence lost a big round in court today. Tom Sherwood live now at federal court with the latest on this story. Tom.
Jim, the ruling makes it a very grim day for district citizens and elected leaders involved in the
Any good reporter, I believe, should look at those who are getting a raw deal and report on it.
The district's second-class status in America. The suit to win voting rights in Congress challenged the right of Congress to control D.C. citizens or local government, saying as Americans, district citizens should be treated like all others.
What have we done to deserve this? People serve in the U.S. Armed Forces from all of the wars we've had, from this city. People have paid taxes, both local and federal taxes from this city. It is wrong, and I don't believe the rest of the people of the United States know how we are treated.
Our claim is that the citizens of the District of Columbia are entitled to be treated the same way all other people who are subject to the same powers of Congress are treated. We can all sit around and wax poetic about the values of America. No taxation without representation. Governments arise from the consent of the governed. Anybody who's paid any attention in civics class knows these things. It's a moral principle. It's a political principle.
Advocates for democracy here say, well, look, we're the only Western country in the world that denies its citizens in the nation's capital a right to vote in its legislature.
Now, late today, both Mayor Williams
I've been a local reporter since 1979, and I've only learned it because I've been doing it for how many years that is. I said, but this is an amazing story of what's happened in the nation's capital. But people drive on the streets and ride the subway and don't see it. And so you learn it over a period of time. But this is an odd place.
And in the voting rights suit, the three-judge panel essentially ruled that, fairly or not, Congress didn't intend to grant voting rights to district citizens because the district is not a state. James, back to you.
All right, big setback. Thanks, Tom.